The Department of Education is a
things, many of which most people are not as familiar with. One in particular is a lot of professional services and IT services. And a lot of people don't think about the fact that we're doing professional.
that's a real core bread and butter of what we're doing. Brett, are you still there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Just check.
Please continue.
Okay. All right. Look, I'm skittish now. And so a big part of our portfolio, and we're gonna iron that out as we move forward, is also IT services. There are a tremendous amount of IT systems or IT products, software development, things like that we're doing in connection with our student aid programs and with a plethora of our education programs, migrant student education. So many of those projects and program offices are utilizing systems. Many of those systems are developed by our small businesses. So that's where we have a lot of opportunity. And so I always show this because it always starts with the mission, and it's important to know our mission and how what we do ties into our mission. So it's always good for me to kind of track that back. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so some may or may not be as familiar with what our office does. Part of what our office does is advocacy, and that one on its face seems pretty obvious, that we're reaching out to small businesses, but a lot of times people don't realize what we're doing internally in terms of engaging the contracting officers, engaging the program officers. Every month, I'm giving small business statistics, allowing our audience, allowing my colleagues to see where we are in terms of our small business and where we need to grow, where we need to develop, where we have more opportunities to increase the aperture for small business. So a lot of what we're doing is in reach activities. Any contract over 250,000 has to go through my office for a small business compliance review, where we're looking to did they do the market research? Did they do what they're supposed to ensure that small businesses have an equal opportunity? My office also provides guidance. We do training. We do a host of training, a lot of training geared towards 8A small business, a lot of training geared towards small disadvantaged businesses, a lot of training geared towards the service disabled veteran-owned small business. So a lot of our training is geared towards those small socioeconomic programs. And what contracts we typically use, which I'll talk about a little bit about as we go through the agenda. But each of our program offices, I think most agencies do that, where most of their program offices, we give them goals to try to reach. And we give them these goals so that way we can be active in trying to get to where we need to get to in terms of growth and building on our small business success. But I always say one of your first steps when thinking about working with a department is working with my office, because there's a lot of market research and things that we can kind of work with you, understand what your business does, what types of services you performed, and we can kind of help you to navigate your way through. Because let's be honest, federal contracting is a very difficult and nuanced environment. And part of the reason why that is because of the federal regulations that are entangled in virtually everything that we're doing. I always say it always starts with our forecast. And the forecast isn't the end all be all, but the forecast will give you a tremendous amount of information to let you know what we're buying in a given fiscal year. Our forecast is a little unique, where we identify set-asides. This is one of the first year we've done that. We're going to continue to do that. But the last slide, I'll have the people that are on my team, and I'll talk a little bit about what each person does. But I didn't want to go too far in the presentation and you not be familiar with what our office does and our advocacy. I also wanted to talk about something that's really, really important, is that our office was able to successfully negotiate all the senior leaders that are over the program offices, their small business goals. And those small business goals are also in their performance plans. So this is a really exciting time at Department of Education, because we are now seeing more accountability that is shared, right? Because, you know, if no one's accountable but me, it's going to be a little harder for me to really do the advocacy the right way. The fact that we have the ability to be more flexible, where accountability is shared, has been proven to be successful. All right, next slide. So these are our small business goals. The data might come up a little small. When I got here in 2020, we were on the decline. And part of the reason why was because the Department of Education for a long time had private collection agency contracts. And those were small businesses mostly that were doing collection contracts. And so, you know, if you ever were to default on your student loans, these were to be the folks that would be calling you to try to get you into a pay status. In 2018, that contract was recertified. So any small business that's on an is on a long-term contract, you generally have to recertify your small business standard, because they want to make sure that, hey, you're really supposed to be getting a contract, and that like a larger business isn't getting a small business contract. So when that happened at the Department of Education, the contractors that were small had phased out just because of the sheer volume of work that was going through the student debt process. And so subsequently we saw a significant decrease in the amount of spend. Before this program was that we were getting $800 million in small business dollars, and that has shrinked all the way down to zero, if you can think about that now. So what the department is doing now is looking at the contracts that we have in our inventory that aren't related to that bigger program, and how we can maximize more small business in those programs. We've been really focused in on HubZone and increasing our HubZone spending, and we've been really focused in on service-disabled veteran-owned small business and how we can increase the spending there, because it's very important for us to find those two key areas and how we can maximize the spending. Because I will say the farthest back I could go is 11 years and we've missed those goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit later in our presentation what we're doing to address that, right? We've observed the problem long enough, and now we're actually doing something. And I think it's good for you to know, because then you'll be able to understand how you can engage the department and really where we're going. It was funny, I was in a small business meeting several years ago, and someone had said to me, hey, you know what, if I see a agency that isn't performing well in their small business, I just take it as they're not interested in small business. And I always try to reinforce that it's not necessarily that they're not interested in small business. It may be other things that are happening. So don't dismiss a potential opportunity because it may not look the way an opportunity may traditionally look. So I just wanted to give that caveat, because that's not just with education, right? So my good friends at HUD, if you were to look at their small business performance, you would say, "Oh man, they're not doing a great job," right? But you wouldn't know that there's some things that are happening behind the scenes, right? They have the housing and urban development has a huge financial correction process in which they were going through and correcting all these financial transactions, and they were de-obligating large sums of money, right? So if you looked at their scorecard, you would say, oh no, they're not doing very well. But in reality, they are still doing very well in terms of small business. But because of the way the numbers are calculated, it doesn't tell the whole story. So again, brings it back to the importance of really engaging the OSDBU and really engaging the office and asking these questions that you might see. Hey, if you're an 8A small business, hey, what are you guys doing to do more outreach to 8A small businesses? What are some things that are happening in terms of building the capacity for small disadvantaged businesses? Okay, next slide. So I always say follow the money. And so what I wanted to provide for you these are actually program offices. So if you were to look in federal procurement data system or the data bank system, you would see these offices as funding offices. And these are the major program offices that are doing the most spending. So here's a fun fact. We have about 11 program offices in total. But one of my first things I did when I got there, I said, well, how many of our program offices are really spending dollars? Because once I figure that, then I'm gonna know who I need to spend the most time with, right? And so you would be surprised to believe that 96% of our contracts are only coming from 5 offices. 96% of our contracts are coming from 5 offices, which means there may be dollars that are coming from other offices, but the preponderance of the dollars are coming from these offices. And it's very important for you to know that, because more than likely, when you see these requirements come out, if you're looking to engage, these are probably going to be the offices that are going to have the biggest budgets in terms of contract dollars. And you can kind of see how they perform across the board. Federal student aid is our largest by far. That is one that most college educated people are most familiar with because of the FAFSA and also the student loan process. The Institute for Educational Sciences is one that people are not as familiar with. They do a lot of data analytics, a lot of surveying. They're the ones that would help us to understand the impact of COVID on African American students, right? They would go out, do the surveys, read the data, and then they would prepare a report, and that report would be published. The Office of Finance and Operations is a huge office for us because they are really the overhead function of the department. Now, what you may not see baked into that is that's where our Office of Finance is, our HR office. We have a contracting office in there. Our grants office is in that office. Our budget office is also there. So there's several offices that are baked into the Office of Finance and Operations. Our security and protection office is there. Our facilities group is there. Just to kind of give you an idea, because my whole thought pattern is if you understand the agency, how they spend, then that will only help you to be more successful in your outreach efforts. And our CIO's office, they typically do very well in the small business arena. In most cases, almost all their large contracts are going to small business, for the exclusion of the telecom and some of those types of contracts that are really large. Sometimes they don't make their way into the small business program. But I'll talk a little bit about what the CIO is really looking at, but IT modernization is a big thing. That's been a big focus. Cybersecurity has been a tremendous focus for us. Zero trust is a big focus. And so those are just some of the things there. The Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, a lot of their contracts are IT service contracts. There is a program that they have that tracks migrant students. That is a system. Part of it is is an unrestricted contract, and part of it is a small business set aside. Just trying to give you a flavor of what some of these contracts look like, some of the work that you can typically expect from some of these offices. Now, if I had a chart that showed more offices, I would say almost exclusively they're buying IT services or professional services of some type. And when I say professional services of some type, that's audits, that's reporting, that's program administration, that kind of thing. All right. So next slide. All right. So the North American industry codes are the bread and butter. I tell everybody in federal contracting, these codes are probably more important than almost any other thing, because this helps us understand what your industry is, how you, whether or not you're small, but most importantly, what the marketplace looks like. And so this is actually a snapshot of how I view the data. And coincidentally, I know that it's helpful for others to view the data in the same way. Okay. And so part of the reason why I love showing this graph is it allows you to see some of the largest spending that we're doing based upon the NAICS codes. And you can see where the opportunities are within some of these NAICS codes. I'm hoping that you may see yourself reflected in some of these NAICS codes. The top NAICS code is where we do the bulk of our spending on the federal student aid side. So when you think about those folks who are given those student loans, you think of your Nelnet and some of those types of companies, they would fall into that top NAICS code. I really want you to see the computer systems NAICS codes, because those are the areas where we're really looking to grow big time. And we're really looking to grow big time in the small business socioeconomic programs, and really maximizing our use of small businesses in those areas, because we can see, based upon SAM, System for Award Management registrations, based upon the SBA's Small Business Dynamics web search, we know that there are more than enough small businesses that are in that area that are doing this work, especially in these IT categories. So what we're doing internally is shifting the focus to make sure that the requirements that come out on the forecast are already earmarked or set aside for the small disadvantaged businesses, the women-owned small businesses, the service-disabled veteran-owned small business, the historically underutilized business zones. Okay. Next slide. So I want you to see why it's important for you to understand the spend data of an agency and year after year. Because if you were to look at our spend data from 2021 forward, that collection agency would be a huge amount of spend, right? And you would say, oh wow, you know, that's where they're spending all their dollars. Maybe that's where I should latch on to, right? But again, this is why it's important to do that market intelligence and working with the OSDBU office and understanding and picking the brains of even program officers to see where the agencies are going. Because if you go to the next slide, you notice that NAICS code is no longer there. The collection agency NAICS code is not even there, right? And you see that the deck is actually reshuffled based upon our spending for FY22. So again, it's very important to understand the dynamics and what's happening as you're engaging agencies, and as you're identifying what your capture strategy will be. I do want to take a couple of moments to say, when you're starting out, you may say, okay, well, there's 24 ACT CFO agencies, chief financial agencies, and those are major 24 agencies, right? but most of those agencies have subcomponents which would triple that number. So there's probably hundreds of agencies, bureaus, etc. So where to start? And I always say start with the spending, right? So if you go to System for Award Management, type in your NAICS code, your North American Standard Code, and then you want to click on Archived, right? And see what solicitations, see what awards were made, and who's buying what, right? Jot it down, and then go to USA Spend. Same thing. Put in that NAICS code, who's spending the most dollars. Now you don't want to stop at the high level, right? Which would be like, let's say you say, oh, I see HHS might be a good target. You don't want to stop there, because what about CMS? What about NIH? What about CDC? Right? Where are their offices? Right? Because otherwise your market research will fall short, because you really want to get as close to the end user as possible when you're in federal contracting, because that's where a lot of decisions are made. The Department of Education is slightly different, because a lot of our contracts are centralized here in Washington, D.C. But I just want to give that little tidbit of advice. All right, next slide. So this, I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but I always think it's very important for small businesses to see themselves reflected in the social economic categories. So I had my team put this chart together just so you can see where we generally are awarding contracts to small businesses and under which NAICS codes. And the reason why I do that is because it's easier for me, just as an advocate, to go back to a program office and say, hey, you just awarded a computer system contract and you did a hub zone. Can this next one be a woman-owned small business or a hub zone small business? And the reason why it's easier for me to do that is because they've done it already, right? And there are codes and there are industries that we have not been able, that we haven't, that aren't represented here. But in most cases, what we're able to do is say, hey, program, the Office of Program and Evaluation just awarded a contract to a hub zone. And so now we're wanting to know if you can do the same thing, right? Being able to have that synergy between the two offices has been helpful. But this chart is something that we use internally, because this is how we are able to see some of the commonalities of the NAICS codes that are represented in different socioeconomic programs. Now, I will also say, as a caveat, there is a possibility that the same business could be represented. We tried to screen that out as much as we could, but what you see before you is a good representation. All right, next slide. So I want everybody, are they able to use their emojis?
Yes, they should be able to.
Okay, just use your emojis and let me know if you are familiar with Executive Order 13985.
Or
Let's see how
attendees,
many.
raise your hands. If you can raise your hand, please, to answer the question. Mr. Mitchell, if you can repeat the question.
How familiar are you with Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support of underserved communities through the federal government?
Right, so we won't know how familiar, but are you familiar? Maybe more realistic questions.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, right. Yeah, are you familiar? Right. Have you heard of it or no?
So we have 4 hands out of the 81 or 78 attendees. We have about 4 to, I would say about 10%. 10% of them raise their hands. So about 10%.
Okay, so this is very vital. And I tell a lot of the minority-owned small businesses to be very familiar with what's happening. So Executive Order 13985 was issued immediately after President Biden was inaugurated. there are several components in that deal with equity. But one in particular that is of interest is Section 5, Paragraph 5. Section B talks about agencies reducing barriers that small business and small disadvantaged businesses may face in contracting with the federal government. This is huge, because what that actually did was promulgated or created a equity plan requirement. So every federal agency had to develop what's called an equity plan. So if you go online and you go Department of Labor equity plan, Department of Education equity plan, something will pop up. Those equity plans addressed what the agencies were going to do to make sure that small disadvantaged businesses have an opportunity in where they've been underrepresented. I encourage everyone to seek out that and use that as a talking point when you're engaging your customers. Now, I would say make sure you're engaging with the customers at the high level. Contracting officers or program officers may not be as familiar. Program officers may, because more than likely, small business goals could be in their bosses' performance plans. Contracting officers may not have as much. They may not have as much relevance for them. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing, especially because one of the biggest focus in our equity plan is the Asian Chamber of Commerce, right? And supporting Asian-owned small businesses and making sure that they have an equal opportunity at some of these federal contracting opportunities. So next slide. Okay, next slide. So we started what's called CLASS, which is creating and leveraging acquisitions for small business strategies. The whole goal of this strategy is to reduce barriers for small businesses, right? And so part of the way we're doing that is identifying small businesses that are able to do work earlier on in the process and doing those set-asides and establishing those set-asides on a forecast. But to get there, there's some other legwork that has to be done. Next slide. So the Department of Education is the only one that's doing this right now. And so basically we're using data-driven decisions to help us make set-asides earlier on in the process. And I'm telling you this for a couple of reasons. One, so you can kind of see what we're doing, but also so that you can challenge other agencies to do something similar, right? So typically what happens is the contracting officer will get a requirement, and the requirement will be issued as a request for information if it's on GSA schedule, or source assault notice if it's on System for Award Management. And it goes something like this. Hey, we have an IT requirement and we're looking for small businesses to participate. Please, if you're a small business and you can do this work, please essentially identify yourself and send a capability statement, right? And you look at it and you say, okay, well, I'm going to submit my capability statement. But there's also something that I've noticed that's happening. Some small businesses are saying, why should I do that? You're asking for a lot of information. You're asking for a lot of data. Some of these RFIs, some of these requests for information and source assault notices are voluminous, right? It's almost like a mini proposal without the cost. And so some small businesses have gotten disenchanted with the actual process. And so what ends up happening is we get our responses back, and usually the way it goes is if you have 3 women-owned small business or Hub Zone or whomever, you can set that contract aside, right? But what ends up happening is you have a diversity of small businesses from all over the place, and we never actually do set-asides. We leave it as a small business. And so because of that, we never get down to supporting our small disadvantaged businesses or our women-owned small businesses, because we don't go that extra layer. So this strategy takes the data, takes the NAICS codes, finds out what population we have of small businesses that are doing work. And if we can get those small businesses in front of our requirements and get that done early on and identify that work, and then all our efforts, our market research, our outreach events, all those things are going to be tied to those requirements that we know are going to happen on our forecast. We're going to maximize the participation and reduce the barriers that small businesses can find, small businesses face. And we're doing all that by looking at our historical data and by identifying trends, basically looking at our trend analysis, spending trend analysis, and finding opportunities for small business therein. All right, next slide. All right, so so far we've been pretty successful in this. Well, I say successful because part of what we had to do was we had to go through the whole forecast. We take the data from the forecast, and then I had to meet with each program office, right? So I'm a senior executive, and each of the senior executives we met, I gave them essentially a proposal of, hey, this looks like it could go hub zone, this looks like it could go service disabled, this looks like it could go women owned, this looks like it could be 8A. And they would say yes, no, indifferent, right? And then from that, we were able to compile all that information and put it on our forecast. This is, again, the first year we've done it, but it's already a great step in the right direction because we have at least 9 service-disabled veteran-owned small business set-asides. We have never had on our forecast a service-disabled veteran-owned small business set-aside. In fact, some of the service-disabled veteran-owned small business set-asides, awards that we were receiving were not by set-asides, they were through competition. And I'll say about 2 or 3 years ago, I was able to convince some of our program offices that maybe instead of going out and doing this full competition and get into the service disabled, why don't we set aside some here and there? And so they did have a little bit of an appetite of it, but this kind of ramps it up a little bit and really creates a real synergy and a real good marketplace for us to make sure that you are successful in our marketplace. All right. And so I talked about the team, right? Because it's the team that really helps to push the requirements. It's the team that's looking at the requirements. So each of my team members is assigned to one of those program offices. And so they will all take meetings. They will all reach out. They will all help you to determine how to be successful in our marketplace. And so I've always wanted to send you this information because it's very helpful for you to know what our team does and how our team engages. You'll see a lot of our team out in some of the events. Hopefully I'll see you guys or some of you guys at the celebration event. I'm not sure who's going to that, but the celebration event in Las Vegas. My plan is to be there. I know I'll be speaking on the panel. But next slide, I think that is the presentation in a nutshell. But I spent a lot of time here, and I'll be timely. I'm sorry, but these are all the resources that really get you in the game. I want everyone under the sound of my voice to please register in our small business customer experience tool. And if you Google small business customer experience education, the website will come up. This is the investment that the department has made in a supplier management tool, if you will, where you're able to upload capabilities, you're able to put in a keyword. So our contracting officers and our program offices, as they're doing market research, they're in this system looking for potential sources. And so we want to make sure that you're there. We're also using this as a listserv, right? We're able to push out information about our events. We put out if there's requests for information or source of salt notices, we get that out through that system as well. Our forecast is published. We update our forecast quarterly. So we're going to be doing another forecast update. So that just to let you know that it's not something that's kind of old and stale. It kind of we are checking it and updating it, and we're doing that quarterly. I don't know. You still may say quarterly is old and crusty. Hopefully not. Hopefully that's helpful. But that's our frequency for right now. Please look at our active contract list. If you're new to the government and you're wondering how to get in, prime contracting can be very daunting. And the way that federal contracting works, the margin of error is really kind of slim. So you really want to make sure that you're able to learn the business. And I always encourage, especially new businesses, to explore subcontracts. And I know some people don't like that, but I swear to you that I've seen so much success from companies who've done that. Now, in parallel, I always say that we will also be looking for smaller purchases or direct awards or things like that, where we can kind of get you geared up, because we want to make sure that we're getting new businesses that are getting opportunities. All right. Now, at the bottom, they're not called PTAC anymore. They're called Apex Accelerators. If you don't know what an Apex Accelerator is, you must find your local Apex Accelerator. They are a free resource that will help you with a lot of this market research and business development, and they'll teach you how to get in the system, so on and so forth. All right. And next slide. All right. And so that's the end of the presentation.
Well, that was the last slide. I'm going to, by popular demand, people want your email address to be displayed again, so I'm going to pull that up. So expect your email box to be bombarded.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, that's what I got it there for.
Well, we have a few questions here that I'd like to get into, and then we have a few other questions that were sent separately outside prior to this chat. So let's start with the questions here that are in the chat box or in the Q&A box. So for folks, again, if you have questions, please don't put it in the chat box, put it in the Q&A box, because that's what we're monitoring for questions. So Mr. Mitchell, the first question here that a member of the audience has asked is, which office includes the grant funding that faculty receive when they respond to solicitation for funding for education, innovation, and program development?
So it depends. So grants are issued through many different offices. I could probably have that specific question. I would probably have to gear to my grants team. But I could. So if you email me that question, I will respond directly to you. We spend almost as much in grants as we do contracts, and it's very fascinating, because a lot of people don't realize that aspect of the Department of Education. So I really do appreciate that question. But I would say send me a direct email so I can get you that answer.
Okay. And it wasn't the person who submitted the question. I don't know who you are because you submitted it anonymously, but I see you just responded saying, I will email you my grant question. So please expect.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, you mentioned that there are a lot of the contracts are awarded in DC, or the place of performance is in DC. Do you not look for companies that can provide remote services such as research outside of the DC area?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So I would say most of our contracts are not happening in DC. Most of the contracting, so the people who are actually issuing the contracting, contracts are in DC. So, and the program offices are mostly in DC, but most of our contractors are not necessarily in DC. So a lot of the work that that's done is done outside of DC. Here's an example. So we have a contract for document shredding. The owner of the business lives in Atlanta, and he can do that because a lot of the shredding is off site, right? It's not on site shredding, but there is some shredding that's on site, and he has a team that comes, right? Some of the work that's done, software development, you don't have to be in DC to do that kind of work, right? You just have to make sure that those deliverables are met, right? And so a lot of the work that we do isn't DC based. So there's a lot of flexibility, and I would even venture to say that that's going to increase, as there used to be a time where I think contracting officers and program managers were pretty convinced that if they weren't able to see you, they weren't paying for you. And I think with COVID, I think we're past that now. And I think we realize that not only do we spend a whole heck of a lot of money trying to fly people all over the place or having them in a geographically locked place, we also there's also some downsides, right? Trying to find space for contractors and so on and so forth, right? It just becomes the clearance process. It's just a very expensive aspect to contracting that I think we're going to that we're getting away from. And I think COVID has accelerated and helped us to get away from that. I just realized I accidentally pushed mute.
I thought we lost you again.
I know.
Now we're all a little bit gun shy here. So I'm glad that
you're skittish. You're skittish. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So there are more questions pouring in, and some really great questions here. So what are top 1 or 2 blind spots that small businesses have when trying to do business with the government? And I'm going to say particularly with the Department of Education, what are some of the blind spots that small businesses face, and what advice would you give companies to make sure they're prepared before trying to do business with the Department of Education?
Yeah, and so one of the biggest blind spots I see is you don't think a lot of times small businesses, really any business in particular, but particularly small businesses aren't thinking about the procurement method, right? Let's say you have the greatest thing since sliced bread, how do I buy it within the regulations and rules that I have, right? Because I can't sole source it, right? The rules around sole sourcing is very difficult unless it's through the 8A program, right? So then that means I have to justify a sole source agreement. And so how do I justify a sole source agreement? I have to there's like 12 or 13 elements that I have to address, and has to be signed through my chain of command, depending on how much the dollars are. That can be very that can turn a lot of people off, right? So then, are you on an existing contract? Can I get to you that way? Okay. Are you 8A? Can I get to you that way? In what ways can I get to you, right? And once you identify that, also leave with that in your pitch, right? Because the technology that you offer, the approach you offer, that's all important. But if I get you in front of a program office and I can't get to you easily through a contract, it's going to be dead in the water, right? So that's one blind spot. Another one is not knowing what the agency is buying and how they buy it, right? So Department of Education uses a lot of GSA schedule. If you're not on GSA schedule, it may be very difficult. And I'm just going to be honest, right? Why? Because there's category management, there's spend under management, which is really saying to the government, use existing contracts, right? So much so that we're actually rated on how much we leverage existing contracts. So this is just goes government wide. So if you're small businesses, they've changed the rules a little bit. And so if you want to look at M1913 or M2203 are 2 good resources that will help you to understand this whole idea of category management and spend under management. but you really have to understand what the procurement rules are and governing and what the typical spending habits of the agency may be. Because if you're on, let's say, if you're not on a contract, it may be difficult, right? Because unless it's a small dollar amount, unless you're 8A, unless you partner with someone, it could be difficult. Why? Because of some of these other policies and things that make it prohibitive. The last thing I would say that tends to be a blind spot is people come sometimes to the government with a technology and don't think about the security. They don't think about the investments that the agency has already made. Here's an example. If you come to me and you say, hey, Calvin, I want you to, I got this great platform that that will make your life so much easier, but it's on Apple. It's an Apple-based system. Well, I'm going to say, well, we don't have any Apples in the department, right? We use Windows products, right? If you come to me and you say, hey, Calvin, I got this great thing and it uses Tableau. Well, if we haven't made any investments on Tableau, or if we don't have any technologies, it may be hard, because now you're asking the department to not only invest in your technology, but I also have to invest in whatever this software or platform is that we may not have already. So just kind of understanding what the environment is. What are they using? What is their operating system? What do they typically use? What have they purchased in the past? But those are a couple of blind spots that come to mind readily.
And you know, that fantastic information. Great question, whoever asked it, but thank you for that answer. I want to pull the string a little bit more on on two aspects of what you answered. One is sole source. Completely understand the limitations and the regulations surrounding sole source, but I also want you to talk a little bit about, it is not entirely out of question that the department does make sole source awards. What is your advice on how do companies position themselves to get those sole source awards and not wait till September 29th to say, give me the year-end money?
Very good question. Yeah, very good question, and that's absolutely true. So there's a couple things that you should know. There's a couple ways that sole source contracts can occur, but it all starts with one particular thing, which is a need, right? So once that need is identified, so the Federal Acquisition Regulations is what governs how we do procurements, right? And so Federal Acquisition Regulation 8.405 has a pathway for sole source. It's called a limited sources determination, there's 3 exceptions, and if the government thinks that one of those 3 exceptions can work, you can write a justification for that. Now, depending on the dollar amount is how much the approvals go, right? So if you're trying to do a $50 million one, that one's going to take a lot more approval than maybe 250,000, right? So knowing what the thresholds are, those triggers. So the other one is Federal Acquisition Regulation 6.305. That one has 7 exceptions, and that one's the one that's most commonly used. And in that one, you can find one of those 7 exceptions that would preclude that would give the government the justification to go on the sole source. So, do you have a technology that's only you own? Is there something that you have that is urgent and compelling in some kind of way? Like if the government doesn't use this, that would be some kind of harm in some kind of way. Is there something that you have that only you own the rights to it, or the technology, whatever that might be? If it fits into one of those 7 exceptions, you may have a pathway. The other one that's not used as often is FAR Part 16.5. And that one is fair opportunity. So anytime, so your GWAC, so like your Alliant, your Oasis, those contracts are all governed by fair opportunity, which means, and that's the reason why they work differently than the GSA schedule, which is 8.405. Everybody has to see the solicitation under 16.405. But in 8.405, not everybody does, because you only need three quotes to have a competition. So under 16, there's also a limited sources determination you can do, but the most common one that takes virtually no documentation is the 8A program. And 8A program is found under FAR Part 16 3.02, I think it's -6, which is authorized by statute. And that's through the Small Business Act. You're able to do a direct award up to 4.5 million for those who are I call them personally owned or operated 8As. And then you have the tribal 8As, which are owned by enterprise or by many different people, stakeholders, and they go up to over 22 million. Now, you can go over 4.5, but if you go over 4.5, it's generally a competitive acquisition unless they do a justification and approval.
So the follow-up question to that would be, when should companies start positioning themselves to get that?
If you can say without a reasonable doubt that what you have is very unique and you're the only one and it's not commercially available, that's a good place to start. So there was several years ago, I remember there was a guy who had a technology, and this technology at the time, he was marketing it to the Army, and it wasn't commercially available, right? Now, because of how the budget process works, we couldn't just smack money down on the table and say, we're going to buy it right now, right? But it took a while, right? Because you got to get in the budget process. You got to, there's a process, right? Now, if you have a technology, and let's say there's a case management system that isn't anywhere on the market, and I don't know, it's 300,000, right? Well, you might actually have a good opportunity, because there could be a possibility that the department may have 300,000 laying around somewhere for some reason, or maybe when they're doing sweeps at the end of the year, that money could be identified and you could get a contract that way, right? But just being mindful of the budgets and the timing, and that sometimes this may be a long-term engagement.
Right. Okay, so the questions don't stop, and I hope you have a few more minutes for us.
Yeah, I messed up in the beginning. So
there's another question here that says there's a company that offers active shooter prevention system through a grant for NASA. Does Department of Education have similar needs, and if so, who or where is that purchased from? For active shooter prevention system.
So that could be a possibility at the state level. And so this brings up another interesting thing. So the department, I always say the Department of Education is interesting because almost every state has a Department of Education. And the state Department of Education does a lot more direct contracting for those types of services than we would do at the headquarters. So depending on where you are, it may be better to start at the state, because even if we had the money, we would probably push it down to the states to administer those trainings. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's a good point you bring up, because there was an early question, which I think is along the same lines. A couple of registrants asked about learning management systems and how should they sell those? Are those a local school system decision, state level decision or Department of Education level decision?
Yeah, and they are definitely local decisions, and rightfully so, right? You could just think about the political ramifications if, I don't know, you take one state that's maybe not the same political affiliation as another state, or someone from because administrations change, and our secretary has a specific political affiliation that may not line up with other people in the United States, and so for that reason, that's why they say, hey, you know what, here's the money for these types of projects, and you as a state figure out how each jurisdiction gets the money and how that money is being spent or not spent. And so a lot of those decisions, when it comes to classroom type initiatives, definitely I would say start local.
And I would presume that also means healthcare staff, like nurses in schools. That's a very local decision.
Absolutely. Very, very local. Yep.
Okay.
And I would even say that's even more local to a jurisdiction, not even a state. Right. So like, if let's say you're given town or township or whatever you may be in, that might be a better place to start, because even at the state level, they may not have day-to-day influence, right? So you may need to go to a superintendent, or if there's a regional board or a county board or something along those lines, that's probably even better, because even at the state level, I have not seen that they've gotten down to that technical level in their contracting process.
So let me ask you about the infrastructure spend, then the Infrastructure Act, and some of the COVID funding that happened that went down from the federal level. Were those decisions made at the local school level? For example, upgrading infrastructure, engineering services, would those be local decisions as well?
Depends on the agency. For Department of Education, yes, those monies were distributed directly to the states. However, if you take EPA, or if you take transportation, those dollars are a lot of times retained at the federal level and administered on local level projects, right? And that's important to know, because if you are, I don't know, let's say you live in New Jersey and there's a cleanup site that's underway, maybe a Superfund site or something like that. You need to know who is handling it. Is that a regional office? Is that a national office? If you're trying to find opportunities, because it's very important, right? Because you don't want to head down to DC thinking, oh, I'm gonna make sure this goes in my backyard, where there may be a contract that's in your own backyard. You just need to figure out who the local people are that are working on the contract and administering those contracts, so that you can reach out. So federal funding, sometimes it depends on the mechanism. In most cases, the department is pushing down monies for specific programs. But it all depends on how the allocations work. And it goes back to kind of understanding how each agency works, right? So Department of Transportation, the Corps of Engineers, right? They get money for specific projects. That money is allocated through appropriations. Those particular appropriations are pushed down to the Corps of Engineers, or to Department of Transportation, or EPA. So it's very important to even understand how that money works and how it flows. And even your OSDBU office will even be able to kind of help you to understand that as well.
Got it. Couple questions and then we'll wrap it up here. How do we get detailed information for opportunities in the forecast? Because typically there's maybe a phrase or a few keywords, that's all that's mentioned in the forecast. How do we get more information to know what is the actual requirement?
Yeah, I always say reach out to our office. There are contracting officers that are identified, but here's the thing. The contracting officers are not the program managers, so they may not know what they don't know, right? And sometimes they'll respond and say, hey, I don't know, or sometimes they ignore it, right? But part of it is part of it is really because they don't know what they don't know, right? Until they get a procurement package, they won't know anything. So I always say, if you don't, if you have any questions, kind of come through our office. Maybe the question has been asked already, and we might have some information, or we might be able to do some digging to kind of help you to identify what's really there. We've been our next round of forecast refreshers will be around that, right? Because no kidding, we had a line item several years ago that said admin services. That's it. Right. And it's laughable, right? Like, why would you even bother? You might as well just left it blank, right? That the amount of, I mean, it was just not helpful. And so part of what we've been doing is, through this whole exercise is trying to get more fruitful information. So, look, get it, contracting officer. You don't want to be bothered, right? Get it. Well, if you don't want to be bothered, give our audience information that they can use, right? And don't.
I think the attendees here will agree that when departments put out information in forecast or even in SAM, if you just include the most basic information, such as who is the incumbent, what was the incumbent's contract number, and just enough information in the forecast, half your emails will go away. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Most basic information is left out.
Yeah, and I said this in a staff meeting one time, and I said, as long as we tease people, they're gonna wonder what's going on, right? Because there's so much you can look into some of these phrases, and it almost makes it laughable. And really, we don't want to. That's not what we want to put out, right? Why put out information that is not helpful for anybody? Because the lack of information is only going to make people either more curious or not even interested in our work.
Right. And it bombards your office with very mundane questions that we could figure out on our own. So we'd rather have you guys respond to our more strategic questions than the tactical ones. So reduce that workload on you guys. And there's the questions aren't stopping. They continue to come, but they're getting more and more specific to their situations. I do want to ask you, you mentioned the celebration event in Las Vegas. Several questions going, what is this event and when is it happening?
Oh, celebration is, let me pull it up. So there's more than one. Hold on, let me pull it up here. I just like this the celebration. I think that's so clever. Okay, so it is June 6th. It's June 6th through the 8th, Westgate, Las Vegas Resort and Casino. And this is the USPAAACC. It's the U.S. Pan Asian American Chamber of Commerce.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully, folks, you guys got the information on Las Vegas event and all the other questions. I think I covered most of them. Again, like I said, the questions continue to come in, and if there's something that we can't answer, so just basic questions. What's the difference between an SDB and an 8A? Those are questions.
So that so if you want me to take that real quick. So
go ahead and take it. Yeah.
So real quick, because that's a common thing. So there used to be a small disadvantaged business certification that you could get that was separate from the 8A, right? Even though, so think that all 8As are small disadvantaged business, but not all small disadvantaged businesses are 8A certified. And so what happened was so you can look it up as the Rafi case, and it was an appeal case that challenged the constitutionality of a set aside based on a minority background, or minority or ethnicity, I think might be the right term. And they won. And so the SBA had to get rid of the small disadvantaged business program, but you can still self-certify yourself as a small disadvantaged business, and that's cool. However, there's no longer a set aside for a small disadvantaged business because now you're self-certified, and it's not a classic certification process that the SBA used to give. Now, the only certified small disadvantaged business is through the 8A program. So when we award contract, yeah. So when we have, so we don't have an 8A goal, we have a small disadvantaged business goal, because if we had an 8A goal, it would eliminate those small disadvantaged businesses that self-certify. Even though we can't do a direct award to them, they still get awards in other ways. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of confusing.
And it made sense to me, but you know, if for those of you who did not, you will get a copy of this recording. You may want to go back and listen to it twice. So,
yeah. Because, but the crux of it is that the 8A is the only way that you can be a certified through the SBA small disadvantaged business. Because it's a business development program for a small disadvantaged business. So so inherently, when I talked about that executive order and I talked about M22 and M2203 and what the Biden-Harris administration is doing, the increase of the small disadvantaged business goal, it was 5%. Now it's going to go to 15% by 2025. That's real. A major way of how we're going to get there is through the 8A program. So I tell people all the time, this may be, they say feast and famine. This may be the feast time if you're an 8A business, because each agency has to increase their small disadvantaged business goal. And again, the main way we get there is through the 8A program.
Okay, you guys all heard this here. We'll wrap it up. Appreciate your time. Mr. Mitchell, before you hang up, any insider baseball, any opportunities, IDIQs that we should be watching for from Department of Education?
So not IDIQs. Our forecast has a lot of good 8A requirements in there. I would say that's we don't do a lot of IDIQs. We do a lot of BPAs. So if you're on the schedules, there may be some BPA opportunities to do some enterprise-wide, mostly in the IT space. So stay on the lookout for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're going to send these slides out, and you will get access to all the links that were put in the slides here. So don't forget to register in the Small Business Customer Experience, join the Department of Education's vendor list. And Mr. Mitchell, thank you so much. Appreciate you hanging in there and working through all the technical difficulties that we had, and audience members. Thank you all as well. On behalf of the Asian American Chamber of Commerce, again, thank you for your time today, Mr. Mitchell, and to all our audience members.
And again, my apologies. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.